My country 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty. Wait, that's not how that goes. Oh yeah. And the bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Ah, dang it. Anyways, I believe that America is a great nation. God bless America.
She doesn't have a plan. She copied Biden's plan, and it's like 4 sentences, like run, spot, run. 4 sentences that are just, oh, we'll try and lower taxes. She doesn't have a plan. Take a look at her plan. She doesn't have a plan.
What up, everyone? And yes, as you already know, it is that time again for us to elect our new leader.
So just a yes or no, you still do not have a plan?
I have concepts of a plan. I'm not president right now.
And if this is your first time to my channel, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, because Donald J. Trump will be the next president of the United States of America. And he's going up against Kamala Harris, and she will not be. So I will be telling a short story of all the presidents who have been shot, along with the heartache of our American people. Sit back, enjoy, let's get it.
In Great Britain, 1775, King George III ruled over the 13 colonies of the American states. And up until that time, these colonies were under British rule for over 160 years. The king imposed a stamp tax, and many of the colonies were opposed to paying it along with the tax on tea. This made the king furious. How dare they not pay him? So he went on to send a brigade of armed soldiers across the Atlantic to get his subjects back in line and under his control. So once the British had set foot onto Boston, Massachusetts, they marched onward into the night. It wasn't long until the settlers heard the war drums and people shouting out, "The British are coming! The British are coming!" Soon the street was crowded with angry colonists who shouted insults at them that God himself wouldn't even mutter. "You lot are a bunch of dogs, you filth! Get out of here, you wankers!" Then they threw rocks and coal and even snowballs, for that matter. It was cold, after all, and out of nervousness, a shot rang out. Bang! Then more shots until 5 people lay dead in the street. Bang! The first to be slain was a freedman and sailor named Crispus Attucks. Paul Revere drew an exaggerated illustration, and the townfolk were furious to learn of the news. John Adams, an attorney at that time, was able to get the soldiers a lesser charge instead of getting the death penalty. If he didn't want to look like a traitor to the king, then he'd better be quiet and stay in line with the Parliament. In 1773, the colonists devised a plan, so they disguised themselves as native indigenous. They took coal to mask their faces, feathers to put onto their headbands, and they stormed each British ship that was docked at the harbour. Found all of the tea crates and threw them overboard. I guess you can say this was sweet revenge, given how the British adore their tea. And the colonists didn't want to pay the taxes on it either, so good riddance. Enter George Washington, a man of unwavering determination. He's fought in the French and Indian War of 1758 and was now nominated to be the war general. He, along many others, opposed to the idea of allowing any of the slaves to fight in the war. After all, economically, it would be suicide, and not only that, with the slaves being property, they were also very valuable commodities. Many of the founding fathers who wrote the Constitution were slave owners, and George Washington was no different, except he had someone he called family, his slave named Billy Lee. He and Billy would go horseback riding while in Virginia. He was the second best, apparently. It's not that those who wrote the Constitution were not in turmoil themselves. They too were wanting to be free from the king. They were also slaves too. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin, among others, would spend 3 days going over the Constitution. Slavery was wrong, and they all knew that. The words that were written were for the colonist, and it had mentioned nothing about the rights of slavery, only the rights to property and ownership, and it would writhe them to know that in a hypocritical sense, even their own slaves should be free as well. This was a moment for the colonists to unite, and unfortunately this issue was kicked down the line until the Civil War. Fast forward. Enter Abraham Lincoln, a man of vision and restoration. He too also owned slaves and was appalled at the notion that the blacks, as they were now being called, were still socially restrained. It was no longer about a British hierarchy, it was about freedom. What had not been done in the 18th century would now have to be addressed in the 19th. The war between the North and the South, and whether if slaves should be free from being called property, waged on from 1861 to 1865. In 1861, during the Civil War, Lincoln signed the Confiscation Act, which would then become martial law. It banned the Confederacy of receiving any supplies, including any aid from slaves. At this time, federal government had limited power to end slavery, since the Constitution was written to preserve individual states, which had their own power to interpret things, along with the power to hammer out their own issues. In 1865, the Union had won the war and over 186,000 black soldiers had fought, and the idea of a reconstruction was just that. An idea. It hadn't come into fruition just yet. Once the Confederacy had lost most of its southern states to the Union, they branched off into a rival party. And not just any rival party either. The KKK was formed from Confederacy war veterans. They are the Democratic, the rival party to the Nationalist Republic. Founded in 1865, the Ku Klux Klan, also known as the KKK, extended into almost every southern state by 1870, and became a vehicle for white Southern resistance to the Republican Party's Reconstruction era policies aimed at establishing political and economic equality for black Americans. Its members waged an underground campaign of intimidation and violence directed at white and black Republican leaders. Though Congress passed legislation designed to curb Klan terrorism, the organization saw its primary goal, the re-establishment of white supremacy, fulfilled through Democratic victories in state legislatures across the South in the 1870s. Abraham Lincoln, Republican and the 16th President of the United States of America. He's the first American president to be assassinated in 1865. He is commemorated on the 1-cent $1 mint and the $5 bill. Shortly after his death, Andrew Johnson, a Democrat and also his running mate, had become the 17th president. His political views were not in line with his predecessor. He wanted to keep the South strong by giving them power through legislation. The Reconstruction he wanted to build had a lot to do with slavery and keeping white supremacy within Congress. He'd veto the 13th, 14th and 15th Amendments, as well as issuing black codes which disenfranchised the blacks even further. Eventually, his shenanigans would catch up to him. He even kicked several Republican committee members from the House of Representatives. In 1868, when the Civil Rights Bill was passed through legislation, which he did veto, by the way, the sitting House was stronger than he was and pushed it through Congress. Many Southerners were furious, and 2 racially fueled outrages would then take place. The New Orleans and Tennessee Massacre of 1868. Many white Republicans from the North, who had moved to the South, were also lynched and branded as traitors. That same year, Andrew Johnson was impeached from the Oval Office and holds the title for being the worst president ever. Parallel to this time period, the women were also under discrimination. It had been the natural order in society that women would not have a handle on political or economical views. And even though the Civil Rights Movement had passed in 1868, not every state would ratify what Congress had already passed. More riots, massacres, and uproars would still persist through the decades. James Garfield, Republican, and the 20th President of the United States of America, along with Lincoln and his ideals. He supported black suffrage and fought alongside the Union. He's the second American president to be assassinated in 1881. He lived 80 days afterwards, then succumbed to his wound. He is commemorated on the $1 mint. William McKinley, Republican and the 25th President of the United States of America. He too fought alongside the Union, but did little to support black suffrage during his presidency. He's the third American president to be assassinated in 1901. He is commemorated on the $1 mint and $500 bill. Theodore Roosevelt, Republican and the 26th President of the United States of America. He was the Vice President and successor of former President William McKinley. During his first term in office in 1901, he invited Booker T. Washington to the White House for dinner with his family. He faced backlash, of course, and he never did that again. Now, interesting enough, sometime during his second term in office, he was in the middle of a scandal. It is believed that certain Democratic Party supporters donated money to his presidential cabinet in favor of socialist policies. Oil and railroads were the thing at the time. He welcomed into motion a federal income tax and the antitrust bill, which prohibits unfair monopolies and, as well as implement an 8-hour workday for federal workers. In 1912, he was nominated to run for presidency again. He flipped parties and now had progressive ideals. During a campaign, he was shot and survived an assassination attempt. He did very little to help black suffrage, even though they were his biggest supporters while he was in office. He also didn't do anything to help out the women's suffrage. The Jim Crow segregation movement was strong. It gave birth to hatred and mass segregation. Sadly, the needle hasn't moved since Lincoln died. Go figure. He is commemorated on the 25-cent and the $1 mint. The women's suffrage was caught up in the First World War of 1917. During the World War I, President Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, was now the 28th President of the United States of America. He was looking for a third term in office and saw that the women had helped out so much and contributed to society. The men were off fighting and they stayed running the economy. He also saw that many black women would give him the vote if he'd lean progressive. So in 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed. Then President Wilson became too sick to run another term. His Democratic Party didn't nominate him on the ticket either. The story behind this tragedy is pathetic. One day in 1921, Tulsa, Oklahoma, a young man was headed to a segregated restroom. He then got on an elevator, and during the ascent, the elevator stops, sending him onto the female clerk, and she screams. Out of fear, the young man is seen fleeing into the Greenwood district. He is apprehended and put into jail. The local news spins an exaggerated story and calls for a coded lynching, so many armed war veterans go down to the jailhouse to secure his safety. Then mobs begin to appear, and more mobs, and soon shots ring out. And for 2 days, the Greenwood district was burned and bombed. Innocent people were massacred. An organized dog whistle was called. Many dependents have lost everything, while some are still rebuilding. This is another stain on America's history, once again. The Civil Rights Movement, 1951 to 1968. This time period showed how the more things change, the more they stay the same. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, Democrat and 32nd president at that time, signed the Fair Employment Practice Committee in 1941, and still most southern states were reluctant to abide by the law. Segregation was still a major problem. The Democratic Party had won majority of black supporters, and the Republican Party had loyalists. The Great Migration from the south to the northeast caused many riots to occur in urban cities. Martin Luther King Jr. along with Malcolm X were both figureheads for the black movement. They saw things very differently and had the same goal: to end black disenfranchisement. John F. Kennedy, Democrat, independent, and 35th President of the United States of America. He believed in black suffrage and the civil rights movement. He believed in becoming the new frontier, with ideas of eventually going to space. In 1961, he signed the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, lowered taxes, appointed Thurgood Marshall to U.S. Court of Appeals, and acquitted Martin Luther King Jr., who had been arrested for sitting at a whites-only table. In 1963, he signed the Equal Pay Act and proposed for more civil rights. He is the fourth American president to be assassinated. He is commemorated on the $1 mint and the 50-cent piece. Lyndon B. Johnson, Democrat and 36th President of the United States of America. He was the Vice President and successor of former President John F. Kennedy. He too believed in continuing to pursue his predecessor's proposals to Congress. So he signed the new Civil Rights Act of 1964, which abolished the poll tax. He envisioned a great society even though the country was in the midst of the Vietnam War. By the end of his second term in 1973, he appointed Thurgood Marshall as the first black person to Justice of Supreme Court. In addition to the civil rights cause, he introduced the Fair Housing Act. During his term in office, many policies were put into place, from Medicare to smog emissions or educational programs for children. He is commemorated on the $1 mint. Ronald Reagan, Republican and the 40th President of the United States of America. He is the 6th president to be shot and the 2nd to survive an attempted assassination in 1981. His political campaign strongly focused on the war on drugs and using Reaganomics to boost the economy. In 1983, just before running for another term, he declared that Martin Luther King Jr. will have his own day. Even though he believed him to be a communist, he is commemorated on the $1 mint. Donald Trump, Republican and the 45th President of the United States of America. He is the 7th president to be shot and the 3rd to survive not just 1 but 2 attempted assassinations in 2024, while running another campaign to become commander-in-chief once again, to make America great once again.
You know, the interesting thing, it's always on my left. It's at rallies. It's always on my list. I only do it about 15, maybe 20% of the time, so I don't do it much. And it's always at the end of a speech. But it's always here. For some reason, they dropped it here. It was at the beginning of the speech, the very beginning couple of sentences. And I turned like a deer bolting, I guess, right? They say good hunters say this. Every once in a while, a deer will bolt prior to the shot. And I don't know, I guess mine was a form of, but I turned around to look at it. It was right here, behind me, actually. And my head was at a perfect angle. It got me.
I believe that he will be commemorated on a coin, don't you think? And so, this is just a short look into the long struggles towards freedom. Injustice and wickedness will always have a way to impede progress. But the wheels of progress move ever so slowly. Even though it may look like the parties have flipped throughout the centuries, be certain that time moves slowly. Today, the left is more about social acceptance, particularly for those who wouldn't want to represent the Republic. And the right is more about economy and policy because they wouldn't want the world to fall to socialism. The women will lean more left and the men will lean more to the right, and that's just how that goes.
We love our country. We take pride in the privilege of being American. And this is a moment where we can and must come together as Americans, understanding we have so much more in common than what separates us. Let's come together with the character that we are so proud of about who we are, which is we are an optimistic people. We are an optimistic people. Americans, by character, are people who have dreams and ambitions and aspirations. We believe in what is possible. We believe in what can be. And we believe in fighting for that. That's how we came into being. Because the people before us understood that one of the greatest expressions for the love of our country, one of the greatest expressions of patriotism, is to fight for the ideals of who we are, which includes freedom to make decisions about your own body, freedom to be safe from gun violence, freedom to have access to the ballot box, freedom to be who you are and just be, to love who you love openly and with pride, freedom to just be.
If you enjoy this video, please give it a like and share it with your friends and family. Subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell. Thank you all for watching, and Heatfire will catch you all next time. Late.